I want to talk about something I said I was going to talk about. I called it Buddhism and the Problem of the Unconscious. That's a pithy title, is it not? Buddhism and the and the problem of the unconscious. And it's probably more or less a paper that if I weren't so lazy, I might tackle. It's a subject that's near and dear to my heart, and I'm avoiding really just getting into it because it's like I'm not being humble. Most of you know humility. Well, it's not like a real problem that I have. I'm not being humble, but it's really just basically a larger topic than I feel capable of jumping into. Plus, it's very scholarly, the whole subject, and so it's not necessarily really what one would call I don't know if appropriate is the right word, but it's not a typical Dharma talk. And it's also, well, there are just many things. I just give up. So I won't jump in this way. Some of you know I actually have been reading 3 books in the past year, three extraordinary books. I've read each one of them through, and now I'm somewhere in the second or the third reading of them, and each of them are that thick. And well, one of them is not. One is Buddhist phenomenology. Just take it from there, right? And it's an extraordinary work. And the other one is really. It's called The Buddhist Unconscious. It's a wonderful book by William Walden. And the third book that I've been reading as I've been referring to, I've been talking about for a long time, is Clearing the Path. And I read it through once at least, and I just open it up and just start reading. It doesn't matter where you open it; it's just fascinating, right? You don't need to start at the beginning or the end. It's just an amazing book. So this is the work of, it's the collected letters of the monk, as I know that I'm repeating myself, the monk Nanavira Terra, who was in the British intelligence in World War II, and actually was the translator. Ironically, I only found this out later, of a book that I was very influential in my early years. And then lo and behold, this is when he was not a monk, when he was, his name was Harold Munson in England. Rather prominent, well-to-do family. So anyway, so he went to Sri Lanka and shaved his head and became a monk. And so most, I would say 2/3 of the book is a collection of his letters to everyone. But his letters are things that he would write 2 and 3 and 4 drafts over, right? I mean, like, they're really essays, and he knew they were going to be published someday, right? And so he labored over them, and his letters are essentially a commentary on the part of the book that is most interesting, which is called Notes on the Dharma. So anyway, I think the man is absolutely brilliant, and he dismisses the commentaries, which is like unheard of. The Visuddhimagga, which is the Path of Purification, is like one of the kind of Bibles of Theravadan Buddhism, and he just says, the Buddha didn't write it; his scholars made it up, and so he's rather dismissive of it. All of that. So anyway, this is a man who I have just enormous respect for. So that's why I'll just start with this sentence, which. I have glasses. These glasses, this is a story here on these glasses. I have these old ratty glasses like this, and the thing is broken, so it hangs this way on that way, and it's got scratches on this. So I went to Florida to visit my brother, and I looked in my suitcase, and I discovered I brought his reading glasses, not mine. And these are much nicer than mine. You can even see better in them. And I thought, well, and so I left him mine. That's the way I have kind of treated that poor guy ever since we were little boys. So here's the sentence that well, it's a couple of sentences. So I'll just start with this, and then I'm just going to go. So he's referring to Freud's theory of the unconscious. Now, this is the man I agree with everything he says almost, right? So he says Freud's celebrated unconscious withers and dies before the blast of Jean-Paul Sartre's criticism in the L'Être et le Noir, Being and Nothingness, I think, where Sartre talks about bad faith or tacit self-deception. Well, so anytime you do that, say like, the Freud's concept of the unconscious withers in the face of one of the famous existentialist philosophers, I just think, I just thought, well, the initials are BS. I just thought that's the most absurd. And I love that. This is a brilliant man, but nobody is going to make Freud's theory of the unconscious wither. It's just a stupid statement, in my opinion. But, you can be absolutely brilliant and still be stupid. I am. No, that's not really true. I'm not absolutely brilliant, but I am stupid. Okay, so anyway, so I immediately Google Mr. Sartre, and I read, and it's a quite... it turns out it's pretty famous. I mean, his criticism of the concept of the unconscious. And it's attractive to some Buddhist monks, which I found very fascinating. And essentially, so I'm going to I'll read this that Sartre said, because actually I think maybe most Buddhists, classical Buddhists, not necessarily Western Buddhists, but certainly this would be classical, probably would agree with this. The psychic factor is coextensive with consciousness, meaning that you can't divide consciousness into conscious and unconscious. There's not a bifurcation. Consciousness is consciousness, right? So in other words, it's an absurdity to believe that there's such a thing as an unconscious, because there's only consciousness. There's consciousness that that we don't have access to, but there's only consciousness. So then Nanavira goes on, and now just check this for arrogance. So he says, based on the Sartre, absolutely destroying Freud and Jung by extension. Nanavira says, the important point is this. Nothing of what I am at present can hide from reflection. Reflection, he means by that mindfulness. Okay. Nothing that I am, and I'm going to just say mindfulness because that's exactly what he means. Nothing that I am can hide from mindfulness, and I am thus totally open to self-criticism. Do you believe you're totally open to self-criticism? I am thus totally open to self-criticism. Were it not so, this is a great sentence. Were it not so, meditation would be no more effective than against our mental defilements than skin lotion against smallpox. Extraordinary sentence, right? If mindfulness could not penetrate into all of our defilements, he said, then it would be as ridiculous as saying that you could put lotion on and cure smallpox. This is the position of consciousness. And I would argue, and this has been a kind of a thorn in my little side for many, many years. I think this is the Buddhist position, the classical Buddhist position. And I would tend to say this makes me dizzy, these are so strong. I would say it's the classical position. So I want to talk a little bit more about that, and then I'm going to talk about that. So that's why, I say the Buddhism and the problem of the unconscious. I don't believe that the idea of the unconscious is actually in Buddhism, period. And you're going to get a lot of people, there's a whole argument. I'll explain that in a minute. I mean, because if you trace the classical Buddhism, you trace the teaching of the Buddha from 2,500 years ago, you can see how they struggled mightily to figure out, well, if there's, how is it that karma travels forward? What carries it, right? I mean, what carries your defilements forward? I mean, from lifetime to lifetime. I mean, so eventually, the Mahayana Buddhism began to pull into this idea that there is this stream of consciousness, and basically similar to the unconscious, it's something called the storehouse consciousness. And so by the time you get 1,000 years over after the Buddha, there's beginning to be in Mahayana Buddhism some kind of a concept that is similar to the unconscious, similar. But even at that, it's still, I mean, it's interesting because the term would be the storehouse consciousness. So even if they're talking about something that is relatively unconscious to us, it's still called consciousness. So, and be that as it may, I mean, I don't really want to press the argument because really, basically, that whole idea died out in Buddhism anyway. So let me just give you a little taste of, this is what the Buddha said. This is a wonderful, he had one disciple who was arguing with him, or not arguing. A disciple was saying that the only thing that we're responsible for, have to worry about, is when those latent, those kilesas, those tendencies that that finally cause us to do something bad. We have to worry about them only when they appear. And so the Buddha said that's not true. So this is the closest that you are going to get to the Buddhist concept of an unconscious. Okay, and it's our old Buddha Ball, and it's quite wonderful. So he says, for a young tender infant lying prone does not even have the notion personality. So how could a personality view, which is Sakyaditi, arise in him? Yet the underlying tendency to personality view lies within him. A young, tender infant lying prone does not have the notion of teachings. So how could doubt about teachings arise in him? Yet the underlying tendency to doubt about teachings arise in him. Then he continues, the underlying tendency to doubt, a young, tender infant lying prone does not have the notion rules. So how could adherence to rules and observance rise in him? Those are the three things that disappear with the first stage of enlightenment, right? Personality view, adherence to rules, and doubt. So that's why he mentions those. But what he's saying is these are latent dispositions that are there even in a little baby. He's implying that there is something that we're born with that is innate in us, that is a tendency towards all of these problems that are going to eventually come. So that's the closest you get to some hint of the unconscious, right? But he never was implying that you don't have access to it. He's never, the Buddha didn't. So in other words, you have in classical Buddhism the idea that we're born with latent tendencies. All of these things that are going to come to fruition is called vitaka. That the fruit will come eventually to cause all the problems that we have, suffering. So latent tendencies is the closest that you come in Buddhism to the concept of the unconscious. Okay. It's time to end. So, by the way, let me just kind of let you know that by the time I end with this, there is no answer to this. It's a problem for us. I think that it's a problem that maybe will be resolved in the next hundreds of years, maybe in the next many hundreds of years, maybe. If there is eventually some synergy between Buddhist meditation and Western psychology, maybe. And it's not necessarily true. So I actually had the privilege of being one of the people who were sitting at a retreat with U Pandita, the marvelous teacher from Burma, who's 90 years old now. I was there when he said, he was in Byrd, but he said, the problem with you Western meditators, he said, you don't meditate on the cushion, you do therapy. So, that was, he had this strong belief that we have a very, very difficult time understanding meditation because we actually transfer it into this idea of doing therapy. So skipping from that to another interesting idea, I was also remember sitting with Shinton Young in a retreat many years ago when he I called it, you all know Ronald Reagan had a trickle down theory. Come on. So I called it Shinton's trickle down theory. So Shinton Young once said, he described, he did a wonderful analogy of mindfulness with light hitting the surface of the ocean. So he said that, and I suppose this is true. I mean, I don't know this stuff. This is what? I don't know what it is. Physics. So he says that when light hits the ocean surface, actually, it'll penetrate down to some degree. But he said that some photons of light will actually go to the very bottom of the ocean floor. Few. And he's described this as what mindfulness does, that mindfulness penetrates to the depth of the unconscious, even though some of it may be, just photons, But in other words, again, this is the core Buddhist teaching, right? That the mindfulness, those light photons, will penetrate to the very floor of the unconscious. Now, I think that is, as I said, that's a Buddhist belief. I think that there's definitely the Asian Buddhist belief, right? And so then if we talk about Western teachers, there's so many Buddhist teachers now who are psychotherapists and psychotherapists who are Buddhist. He's from Vice Center. I don't really know, it may not be that it's across the board, but I'm going to suggest to you that it is the fundamental problem of consciousness that it denies that there is an unconscious. So in other words, it's not just a Buddhist thing. In other words, my suspicion is that in the West we have almost the same problem. So why you can well see then why in the West we're kind of maybe drawn to Buddhist meditation, because to some extent part of it actually match our own bias against the fact that there's something that is alien that we cannot penetrate. Does that make sense what I just said? That so if you go to college, most of your psychology is going to be cognitive behavioral therapy. I would say 80%. I said a long time ago that the first cognitive behavioral therapist on this earth was Buddha, was Mr. Bob Buddha. He's a great cognitive, he's the best. The whole concept of thought, that thought creating reality. But so my suggestion is that that the part that we are leaving out, and we do it in the West as well as in the East, but the part that we leave out is this idea that there is some part of you that you don't have access to, that exists, that is real in some way, that is living right as you are living against the wall, Cindy. It's living, it's there, but your consciousness does not have access to it. And of course, Mr. Freud called that the unconscious. So I was in a wonderful seminar in Southern California, psychoanalytic something, many years ago, and I took this course with this brilliant Iranian analyst, and there were like about 12 of us, and we were sitting around this table because a seminar, and she was quite wonderful and quite passionate, and she was talking about Freud's insistence that you can't be a psychoanalyst unless you've been psychoanalyzed. And of course, he's the first person who said that, right? He just said you cannot, he would not allow anyone to have this, I don't know, is someone talking while I'm trying to talk? So anyway, we're all, it was very wonderful. It was all quite wonderful. So she got to this one part and she said, So she leaned forward and she said, so why is it, do you think, that he insisted that you have to be psychoanalyzed in order to become a psychoanalyst? So we all went around. She made everyone give an answer. We all went around the table. And everybody, it was just a bunch of smart people. And so when it came to me, because I came from the Jungian tradition, I said, I think he did that because he understood that you cannot take somewhere where you've not been. Now that's a basic Jungian view, right? You cannot lead someone, down any stairs where you have not gone before. Because if you do that, and some trouble comes and you've not met that trouble, then you're going to be potentially very damaging to that person. So I thought that was the best answer of the 12. Everyone was going, oh no. And she, of course, said no. She said no to everybody, and everybody was every answer was wonderful. She said with this very thick accent, she said, because he knew that this is the only way you would come to know the reality of the unconscious. And you could just feel, it's like there was like a kind of sense of awe in the room as she said that you have to go through this to even have this understanding, right? That there is something called the unconscious. And again, just to go back to Mr. Sartre, as you read, it's like the interesting thing about Sartre is he even came up with this expression, existential psychoanalysis, which is just wonderful. He never worked with a client in his life, right? He never worked with anybody. He never did psychoanalysis. But that's just typical of philosophy. Philosophers, they're going to figure the whole thing out. But the point where did Freud come up with this theory of the unconscious, right? He came up with it by working with hundreds of people, right? And then analyzing their dreams, and then suddenly starting saying, what is this? How is this extraordinary intelligence coming from the dream? So then, of course, Jung did the same thing. Meaning that everything, his idea, of the introvert and the extrovert, and his idea of the feeling type and the thinking type and the sensate type and the intuitive type, it all came from nothing but data, empirical data of working with people. So, so I have two more things to say. So first of all, my suggestion is that, well, let's see, I have 4 things to say. I have 10 more things to say. So first of all, meditation has been on the face of the earth for over 3,000 years. We don't really know how long it's been on the earth. But for sure, the Buddha, when he studied meditation, he studied with 2 of the greatest, most famous teachers in India. That was 2,600 years ago. They were all, in other words, it was that formed, right, that there were these phenomenal teachers in India, even at that point. So how far back does that go? Obviously, more than, at least 3,500 years. That's how old it's been. How old has the work from Freud and Jung? How old is that? 150 years? I can't count 1900 to, less. So so the concept of the unconscious is extraordinarily fragile, and it has not taken root in the West. Forget the East. It hasn't taken root in the West. I promise you. Maybe you know that, or maybe you do, but if you don't know that, I can promise you it hasn't. How many of you have an unconscious? And how many of you are really, how many of us are right in touch with and work with it? There you go. So, so I said I had 2 things. So when I started what I call, like the 3-month retreats and 6 months, and I first did psychotherapy with one of the greatest dream analysts in the world. His name was Dr. Edward Whitmont, very famous. And so I worked with him for 2.5 years. It was quite wonderful. And anytime I had a problem, his little eyes would twinkle. He would say, "Well, we'll see what your dream tells you this week." It was amazing. It was just amazing. And I would come back, and you're there, and invariably there would be a dream, that I had, and then he would make me write them down. I had to write them down and bring them to him. So all of my work in meditation was set up by that 2.5 years in New York with him. So then I sat for almost 3 years in Byrd, and at the end of that was 1989, and I was at a point in my life where it was like there was part of me that was part of me really wanted to stay and maybe even become a monk, at least go to a monastery. I don't think that anyone could have tolerated me being a monk, but anyway, so there was this instinct to go in that direction, and there was this instinct to go back into the world. And I had a dream one night, and I don't know if you all have heard this dream, but so it was early in the morning, so I had this dream, and I'm at a picnic, and there's this huge table of food, and it's wonderful hot dogs and potato salad. It was just most wonderful, like a church picnic, right? Just all the most wonderful food, fruit. And I'm standing there, oh my God, I'm having the best time. I'm standing there, I'm sitting in a field, and it's beautiful, right? And it was so real. Oh my God. I mean, you've had dreams like that, right? Where you would swear it's real. And you could smell. And so anyway, and all of a sudden, so we're all there, and I'm, lots of people, and all of a sudden you hear this noise, and there's a plane coming over. And it's a little low. I mean, so everybody pauses from the food, and they look up, and it's so low that you can see people looking out of the window down. So that's low, right? And so then you get in the dream, it gets kind of like something kind of funny in your stomach, and the plane goes over past us, and there's a little knoll, and it goes over that, and then it crashes. Huge crash, a huge plume comes up. Terrible. And in the dream, so everybody, and every single person, there were maybe like 80 people, they all go flying towards the plane, except one person, me. I stand there and I think, well, there's no point in my going. They were all going to help those people, and I'm thinking, here's all this delicious food. And so, isn't that awful? It's very sad that I did that, and so I thought, so I'll just have a hot dog. I don't like it when people laugh at me. So anyway, but then I think, oh hell, I better go and help people. so I don't. I put the food down and I go, I'm a little bit behind, but I follow and we go over the thing. What happens when I go over the knoll is that it was not a plane that crashed. It was a spaceship. And so then the whole thing, there were fragments of this spaceship, and then in my thought at that moment came the word Challenger. And it wasn't, Challenger had exploded, that's the one with the school teacher. It had exploded not long before that. This was 1989 when I had the room. I think that was in the 80s. But anyway, so I'm standing there, and you can see that parts of this thing have crashed to the ground. But then suddenly I realized, oh no, the explosion has just happened, and things are falling from the sky. Enormous objects are falling from the sky. And so the people start scattering in all directions, running and running and running. And they start running into these little shacks, like little huts or things. And I realize, oh my God, if they get in there to hide, they're just going to be squashed like a bug, because that thing is going to crash on the top and kill them. And so all of a sudden, I stand out in all these people and I scream, stop. The only way you can save yourself is to look up and watch and then dodge before it hits. And that's what everyone starts doing. So the thing, and you could see it's like it would be like this tiny dot, and then it would get bigger and bigger. So that by the time it was like it was enormous. But people were jumping and dodging and saving themselves that way. So at one point, so they all stop, and then I look, and then the thing that was coming to hit me, but it missed. And I look, and it's a fragment, and inside is the most beautiful being I've ever seen in my life. This extraordinarily beautiful being. It was androgynous, I would say, male, female. It wasn't, but it was just beautiful being, human, radiant, and terribly injured. Terribly injured. This is a dream. Terribly injured. Barely alive. And I run over to it and kneel down. And I think, I don't even know CPR. And I have got, it is up, if this being is going to be saved, it's only me that can save it. It was overwhelming. And it was, and also like this feeling of unpreparedness, and that in my life I had not, I did not know how to save someone. And there it was, waiting. And then I heard these bells, the church bells ringing. And then I woke up because it was actually the bell of the morning to wake us up for our meditation, 5 o'clock. That dream, from that dream I went into psychology. From that dream, I came here and got my master's degree, my doctorate degree, blah, 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 and became a therapist. But from that dream for me was that that there's something about, healing, and that I needed more training. And, I just thought, I could have said that, that being was myself or whatever. Who had that dream? This was asleep. This was sound asleep and probably snoring, because I have a tendency. Who had that dream? What would your meditation teacher say? Just note it? Who had that dream? It was certainly the psyche and the unconscious. I wouldn't even presume to answer. And I don't know if you, but I've had more than one dream like that in my lifetime. But they were always archetypal, meaning that they were about something ready to change. So I share that with you just to say that I hear not many times, but from people who have been sitting for many, many years. Recently, it touched my heart deeply. Someone was talking about that they've been sitting for maybe 20 years, and they still have a type of sorrow and sadness. It's never touched. The meditation has never touched it. This was an email, and I wrote back and I said to this person, I said, I think that those problems lie with a little boy who was very, very, very hurt. And this person was very hurt. And I said, I don't think you're going to find anything about this in Buddhist scriptures. And the problem is, and this is the way I will end this, because this is where I say the Buddhism and the problem of the unconscious. Here's the problem. You find a really good Buddhist teacher, and they will all say, particularly in the West, they'll say, oh yes, this is a psychological problem. You need to go to a therapist to work that out, right? But in other words, we will conceptualize psychology as only for people who are, have problems, abnormal behavior, or illnesses. It never occurs to a classical Buddhist teacher that there are truths in the psyche, such as the dream that I have, that don't have anything necessarily to do with, the number one with woundedness per se, and that I believe that someday meditation will include that we will sit with the unconscious, that meditation will expand to include psychology. Meditation will expand so that when U Pandita said, no, you people don't do meditation, you do therapy. At some point, I believe if this really works, if we really have a synergy someday, and it is not clear that we will. It really is not clear. But if it happens, meditation will somehow expand and incorporate the deep truths of Freud and Jung into meditation work. Until it does, we're going to have people who sit for 20 years and do not get at some core woundedness that is still there and causing suffering.